what could be more incarnational? Jesus was born covered in blood through the Middle Passage, through a woman came into this earth. We need to embrace the holiness of
the masks in JUNKANOO were originally meant to be frightening. They were designed to be frightening. They were the connection with the other side. And to this day, people still talk about the spirit of JUNKANOO and being not possessed, but recognizing this otherness that is involved in the performance of JUNKANOO.
Okay. JUNKANOO, I remember being told by my late uncle, in his childhood, it was terribly frightening. They had a figure, it was just one man, they called him Solomon Hole. He would dress up. It's a part of the secret society tradition. It was meant to frighten the children and keep them in line.
But we conceal to reveal. There's this reversal that happens. The thing that you fear most actually is the thing that is most liberative.
Our people are being torn apart, largely by religious schizophrenia and cultural schizophrenia. What we need now is to heal ourselves and our people.
Welcome back. Okay, so this is the part of the evening when we want to talk all things theology. And we have two designated speakers, but you can be an additional voice with your question. And if you want to even join the panel, just let us know. We'll be glad to include you. So we are going to now hear from a good friend and mentor, if you like, to Carlton. We have Reverend Canon Dr. Kirkley Sands, who is a pioneer of research in Bahamian slave spirituality. And he's going to share with us now some theological insights, but just some brief things to say about Canon Kirkley. He's a graduate of the University of the West Indies, the University of London, as well as the University of Edinburgh. And his PhD was achieved from the University of Edinburgh. And he's presently the Dean of Faculty and a lecturer in Codrington College in Barbados. So, Reverend Dr. Kirkley Sands, we now look forward to hearing from you with your theological insights. Welcome.
Good, thanks. Let me begin by congratulating Carlton and encourage him to continue on this path. I would like to make one or two general statements before speaking to a theological reflection on Bahamian JUNKANOO. And the first is that all theology is contextual. All theology is contextual. And every context where theology is done is a domicile for culture, for spirituality, and is concerned with the whole issue of identity, including and especially cultural identity. I would also like to share an opinion that theology cannot be done either intellectually nor socially in a vacuum. It must have a context. And from an academic perspective, that context is in large measure interdisciplinary. I have found it necessary, for example, to engage social science, to engage, from a layman's perspective, Jungian psychology, to engage aspects of sociology in addressing the whole issue of Bahamian JUNKANOO from a theological perspective. Having said that, I will add the following. Since the attainment of majority rule in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas in 1967, there have been concerted efforts on the part of many Bahamians to research, reclaim, reaffirm, and celebrate the West African aspect of the Bahamas' cultural heritage. An important aspect of this heritage, which includes much of what Bahamians have long held dear, is the spirituality and the culture of enslaved Africans in the Bahamas and their descendants, calling ourselves Bahamians. Subhuman conditions under which enslaved Africans were brought into the Caribbean and the Americas via the Middle Passage did not permit them to bring any of their ancient, cherished institutions with them. They did well to have survived the rigors of the Middle Passage. This notwithstanding, they did succeed in bringing with them a dynamic cultural memory and a vibrant spirituality. Just one or two comments, or the general comments about spirituality. Spirituality may be defined as the personal relation of a human being to the divine. It is an ontological phenomenon by means of which communities and peoples can purposefully relate to the divine, whether we call the divine God or otherwise, and relate to and interact with their fellow human beings and the world of nature. As such, it can be used interchangeably with religion. Spirituality is therefore an ongoing experience which is holistic, self-transcending, and oriented towards ultimate value and purpose in life. It is the lens through which peoples and communities perceive and understand themselves and their empirical world. Its purpose at the personal level is individuation. At the ethnic, national level, its purpose is life integration. Spirituality and culture, though distinct, are nevertheless interconnected. While spirituality has the dynamic to transcend and transform culture, it invariably expresses itself in and through culture. It is to culture what God's grace is to nature. God's grace perfects nature. It does not destroy nature. In sharing a theological reflection on Bahamian JUNKANOO, I'd like to begin by citing a 19th century writer from Barbados. Now, Barbados is not known ever to have had JUNKANOO, but I think this citation is apt. George Pintard's description of Barbados' slave celebration of a Sunday in 1816 is somewhat reminiscent, mutatis mutandis, of Bahamian JUNKANOO. This is what Pintard wrote. They assemble in crowds upon the open green, and forming a ring in the center of the throng, dance to the sound of their beloved music and the singing of their favorite African yell. The instrumental parts of the band consist of a species of drum, a long hollow piece of wood with a dried sheepskin tied over it, a kind of rattle, and an ever delighting banjo he means. The dance consists of stampings of the feet, twisting of the body, and a number of strange incidents. The head is held erect or occasionally inclined a little forward. The hands neatly meet before, the elbows are fixed, pointed from the sides, and the lower extremity is being held rigid. The whole person is moved without lifting the feet from the ground. Making the head and the limbs fixed points, they writhe and turn the body upon its own axis, slowly advancing towards each other or retreating to the outer parts of the ring. The gravity, solemnity of countenance under which all this passes is peculiarly striking. Not a single smile, not a significant glance, nor any modest look escapes from either sex. They meet under the most settled and meaningful gravity of countenance. They dance without any interval for several hours. Bahamian slave spirituality was essentially West African spirituality adapted to the conditions of chattel slavery in the Bahamas in the 19th century. I will now fast forward and speak to Bahamian JUNKANOO from a theological perspective. That which Pincard referred as the Barbadian slave's favorite African yell was probably the African shout, known as the ring shout in the United States. In his book, The Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois, understanding the shout as a form of communion with the invisible or the divine, speaks of the devotees of the shout as being seized by the Spirit of the Lord, and thus made mad with supernatural joy. Given the parallels between the religious culture of West Africa and that of the Old Testament in the Christian Bible, there is no doubt that the shout was to the slaves, the enslaved, what is the Hebrew word teruach, which means shout in Hebrew, was to the Hebrews. The Hebrew teruah or shout can have a number of connotations. You see one in Psalm 27, verse 6, for example, Psalm 33, verse 3, where teruch means shout or shouts of joy. In Psalm 89, verse 15, a blessing is pronounced on the people who know the festal shout. Here, teruach connotes the people's joyful response within the context of the Hebrew cultus to an overwhelming experience of Yahweh or Jehovah, Yahweh's goodness and majesty. In 1 Samuel 17 and 20, however, it denotes a war cry, as it does also in Joshua chapter 6 and verse 20. In Leviticus 25 and 9, a signal it means, and in Numbers 10, 5 and 6, it means an alarm. According to Psalm 47, verse 5, it could also be a cry of homage, in which case the psalmist, displaying unspeakable faith in Yahweh Elohim, the Lord God, promises homage because he is quite convinced that Yahweh, Jehovah, will help him. We find a similar expression of faith in Yahweh in Psalm 3 and verse 3, where Yahweh is spoken of as a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter up of my head. The words teruach, shout, and sabab, circle, symbols, become especially powerful when used in the same context as in Joshua 6:3, 15 to 16 and 20. It is with particular reference to Yahweh as the one who lifts up one's head, however, especially when compared with Psalm 2:27, verse 6, where the principle of the reversal of fortune, the term is peripetia, the reversal of fortune seems to be in evidence. But one sees a parallel with the erect position with which Bahamian JUNKANOO, at least once upon a time, used to hold his head, his because it was a male celebration. In Bahamian JUNKANOO, the shout is replaced with the bugle. What Kintar described as the slave's favorite amusement was undoubtedly his unwitting observation of the slaves at worship. It is significant that such worship should occur not only on the day when the slaves enjoyed an interval from turmoil, but also on the day when their Christian masters, so-called, commemorated their Savior's resurrection. For as the Judean exiles in Babylon used Saturday, which to their captives was a hard-lucky day for their religious purposes, so too these African exiles, these enslaved Africans, used Sunday, a day of rest and worship, for their captors to their religious advantage. How did they do this? By giving liturgical expression to the unity of the two-dimensional time frame in African ontology, where you have Sasa or micro time and Zamani or macro time, two Swahili words used by John Mbiti in his African ontology. So by giving liturgical expression to the unity of the Sasa and the Zamani, fellowship with their ancestors, and the renewal and reinforcement of cosmic and community life, the locus of their several hours of worship constituted, as it were, their Isle of Patmos, where they could envision a new world order and an alternative community. Melvin and Francis Oskowitz observed a similar dance in Suriname and claimed that the dance there related identically to the elements of the ancestral ring dance in the United States. Their feet executed figures in place without leaving the ground, the arms hanging loosely at the sides, the arms fixed and held rigid at the elbows and knees bent but rigid. The movement of the feet, angular and precise, was reiterated by the outstretched palm, while all the muscles of the hip took up the rhythm. For enslaved Bahamians, as for Africans generally, dance was primarily religious and was practically inseparable from worship. Hence the enslaved's solemnity and gravity of countenance, as observed by Pincard. According to Amory Talbot, dancing affords Africans the one means of representing as perfectly as possible their otherwise inarticulate sense of the mystery of existence, the power of the supernatural influence which enfold them, the ecstasy of the joy and life of youth and strength and love, all the deeper and more poignant feelings so far beyond expression by mere words. And whether the occasion be one of rejoicing or grief, of victory and war or funeral, thanksgiving to the gods for their blessings of crops and children, or mere social amusement, it is by far dance is the chief and almost the only way of picturing and depicting their affections and sensibilities. From the perspective of Bahamian JUNKANOO, the slave celebration of what probably originated as an annual yam festival, adopted to the conditions of New World slavery, had the effect of doing at Christmas what the Western Church did in the 4th century AD, on the day that the Romans celebrated Naculis Solis Invicti, the birth of the invisible sun. These slaves also used the feasting and merriment associated with Christmas for their religious purposes, as the Christians of the 4th century did in the case of the Roman Saturnalia. Could it be that the slaves chose to celebrate JUNKANOO at this time, not only because of the free time the masters afforded them, but also because of the messianic implications of the Hebrew word sabab. Could it be too that they were challenging the church, organized Christianity, after the manner, so we wish to see Jesus, that is the Jesus whom the church proclaimed as Messiah, and with whom so many slaves readily identified. After commenting theologically on sabab, the authors of the Theological Word Dictionary of the Old Testament make the following summary comment. All of the foregoing finds its fullest expression and climax in the work of the Messiah, who would triumph over all the enemies of God and man, redeeming his own and ruling over a changed and revitalized earth. Bahamian JUNKANOO is thus more than a secular celebration. It is a unique embodiment of Bahamian slave spirituality. Because of its African roots, it has a cultural past, which is similar in many respects to the religious culture of the Old Testament, and shares the Old Testament hope for the coming of the Messiah, the Christ, who for Christians is Jesus of Nazareth. By way of conclusion, if I'm allowed another minute or two, spirituality, like culture and identity, is dynamic. It is never static. No generation of Bahamians was more aware of this than the Bahamians' slave ancestors, enslaved ancestors, I should say. Under the most adverse of circumstances, namely chattel slavery, they, with their dynamic cultural memory and resilient spirit, forged spirituality and a cultural identity which was neither that of their ancestors nor that of their slave and colonial masters. It was, at least seminally, Bahamian, and therefore fundamental. It is on this spiritual and cultural foundation that Bahamians today are privileged to build, but there are challenges. Historically, the Bahamian experience of chattel slavery has been followed by that of colonialism and political independence, respectively. Geographically, the Bahamas is neighbor to the world's remaining superpower, the United States of America. Economically, Bahamians depend almost entirely on tourism, and to a lesser extent, on financial services. Technologically, the world has become a global village, and the Bahamas is very much a part of it. It would appear, therefore, for the ongoing development of a Bahamian cultural identity, the Bahamians' life setting calls for two things in particular. Let me reread that statement. It would appear, therefore, that for the ongoing development of a Bahamian cultural identity, the Bahamians' life setting calls for two things in particular. These things are: one, a rebirth of identity by returning to Bahamians' ancestral roots, and two, an openness to and an acceptance of other spiritualities and subcultures which presently exist in the Bahamas. Thank you, Dulcie. The extra minute or two.
Thank you. We're going to hear more from you later as we have a conversation with Carlton, but we appreciate you being here this evening and taking us all over the place with your deep University of Edinburgh theology. Thank you. Let's have our last contributor for the evening before we engage with our conversation together. And our next guest could be forgiven if she felt a little left out, in that she's not a Bahamian, but she's a proud Jamaican. Jamaican born by birth, of course, British by nationalization. And she's currently a freelance theologian and a full-time carer. But she has earned a special place to be on the panel this evening because she has traveled the road with Carlton with his PhD journey. And so she was one of his supervisors, and she's here this evening, not only to share her joy of coming to the end of the road with his PhD, but of course has something to say about the work, and indeed bringing in some Nannyish theology as we talk about JUNKANOO this evening. So Reverend Dr. Evie Vernon O'Brien, thank you very much for being here. Over to you.
Thank you. And isn't it wonderful to be here? Carlton, a pro day you can't done. So, brilliant. Okay. As Dulcie has expressed, I am Jamaican. So I've been to the Bahamas once. So, and we have JUNKANOO, but only a little bit, you know. But we do participate in the whole African diaspora spirituality through revival at the barnyard, through Pukomina and Kumina, and through Rastafari, which many of you will be familiar with. I'm going to sort of go, I was thinking about it, and I'm dedicating what I'm saying to some ancestors, some of whom are still with us, and some who have passed over on the other side, but are probably here in this discussion even now. One I want to remember because he made the transition, well, him dead, yeah? The Reverend Canon Patrick Gordon, who is a Jamaican priest, an activist theologian. And one of the things that the lights that Ernly threw on the whole issue of embrace that Carlton finishes with is a way of trying to work through in his own context, and particularly the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Kingston in Malines Road, of how you bridge between the Anglicanness and the Africanness. And Ernie had no problem. The church had dances. Dance was part of the Eucharistic experience, and I think it still continues. And he looked at certain things. He was a diocesan exorcist, but he always maintained that while you're doing the ritual of banishing evil spirits, which is very Anglican, you also need to have a ritual of inviting good spirits to remain with blessing with rum, which is very African. And we wrestled with Canon Ernly all the time, how you embody your Africanness and your Anglican theology. Anglican Christian is Anglican Christian sometimes. It is, not all the time. All right. Here is where we're going. So that's one ancestor I want to mention and hold up, which is part of the issue that the churches need to embody the Africanness as part of their worship, as part of their theology, as part of their preaching. I want to hold up a Reverend Dr. Hyacinth Ione Booth, a Methodist minister, who through all kinds of struggles, she was the first person to lead the graduate program at the United Theological College of the West Indies, where I went. That's the other place Anglicans in the Caribbean go. Carlton and them go to Codrington. Those of us, the Anglicans from Jamaica, go to UTC. Okay, so there's a kind of a little fun going on there. And Dr. Booth looked at, among many other things, the role of the barnyard. And what her book, Breaking the Silence, is something, I'm not going to call it seminal, it's ugonal, from ovaries. You see, seminal is to do with men and things. But it's a way of looking at things. I want to mention the Caribbean Women Theologians for Transformation, CWTT, which is an online group of women from across the Caribbean, as loosely as you find, because I'm still in it, and we have friends from Canada and so on, but who are Caribbean based. And it's a live group, so we're deeply involved in wrestling with the region, helping the region to theologize on things such as the abortion laws, on the issues of sexuality, and the sexuality laws that we brought from the UK, the anti-sodomy laws. and all kinds of madness, and how things that deal with our bodies and the theology related to that. I want to mention, just in passing as well, there are so many others, but Canon Harry Sawyer, who was a Sierra Leonean, who lectured at Codrington, and we got to borrow him at UTC, dealing with African theology. Now, this is important because one of the things that he said, which I'm going to relate to this Nannyish theology a little bit, when we were discussing, the business of the negation of women and women's bodies, and because we bleed, and he said, it is because men are so terrified that who are these people who can bleed without being hurt every month? They must be divine, so we better control them. And I want us to keep this in mind. And I speak of the Reverend Dr. Marjorie Lewis, who coined the term Nannyish theologian, yeah? And she also, when she was president of UTC, as part of the theological experience, invited in people from the barnyard, the revival tradition, to have a barnyard experience so that the students at the college could theologize on that part of the Afro-Caribbean experience. Now, Nanny was a resistance leader in Jamaica. Can't go into it too long, but Nanny and the Maroons, the Africans who decided that they were going to resist this slavery thing. And Nanny was we don't know her actual name, but she was a leader. And they defeated the British and got 2 treaties signed, 1739 and 1740, for independence for the Maroon community. So Nanny is a leader of resistance. And we who are womanist theologians in the Caribbean, we embrace that culture of resistance. And I want to put in a particular plug here. One of the things that Carlton mentioned in the book about, the whole link between Africanness and vulgarity, what we call in Jamaica slackness and rudeness and lewdness, and this looking at the African body as somehow sinful, particularly, and too much moving. We were not permitted to move about in church, and the idea of dancing and swinging, this is the Anglican thing, and clapping, these things were thought to be very sinful. And what a contradiction it is, yeah? And if Black bodies were sinful, women's bodies are always problematic, and Black women's bodies were particularly problematic. And we were told that and I don't know how they thought we managed it when we became ministers inside the sacred space, that if you were having your period, you weren't supposed to approach the altar. Now, this, if you're talking women as priests and women as deacons and deaconesses, that makes life and servers, a little bit challenging, And I want to put to us, and I'm going to really put this forward a little bit and be graphic. You see, Anglicans, we say that we are an incarnational church. This is at the heart of Anglicanism. And I want to put to us, what could be more incarnational? Jesus was born covered in blood through the middle passage, through a woman pum pum, came into this earth. We need to embrace the holiness of the pum pum. Blessed be our bodies. Blessed be our bodies. Amen. Done for now.
How do I follow that? Well, you have the chance to take more questions or present your questions to Evie. Thank you very much, Evie. Let's finish the conversation now, shall we? With everyone coming back, let's invite Dr. Kirkley Sands to come back. Carlton, please do come back. Evie, thank you. Nicolette. I wonder why you're laughing, Carlton. Ian. Let's have a conversation now. Now, I must say to you, Evie, whilst you were talking, hands were raised. And yeah. See what you started, Carlton. Now then, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for the questions that are coming in. We've had some serious ones, indeed, and talking about ancestral worship. And I want to go, I think, to the question that I'm being careful not to call people's name, just in case we didn't mention this. So I'm going to ask this question. The churches have neglected, embodied, and often negated the Africanness of their faith. How do we, this is coming to you, Carlton, how do we bridge the false but real chasm between Africanism and Anglicanism in the Black pilgrim of the Christian church?
Yeah, I saw that question and I really love that idea, that phrasing, false but real. And because no matter what you do, you're incarnate. You can't hide the embodied nature of faith, any kind of faith tradition. But the perception that it should not be, that's the problem. And Evie, graphically, I'm still reeling from your graphic stuff. How do you deal with that? I think people on this panel and myself as a theological educator, we're trying to do it. We're trying to educate, trying to ask big questions, trying to expand the way we understand faith. We don't think theology. We don't think church. We live these things. You know, we're not disembodied beings. And the more we can have the kind of education, not just of clergy, but of people on a Sunday, in explicit and implicit ways, just educating, keep educating. Do you know about your roots? Why do you call it evil? Why is there a chasm? These are bigger questions. And wherever you're coming from in your, I guess, Christian tradition, that's our task. We have to educate and ask questions and move beyond where we are.
I don't know if you want to add to that. Thank you, Carlton. Canon, do you want to add to that at all before we move on with another question about the church?
Yeah, just one or two points. Picking up Evie's point of claim that Anglicanism is an incarnation of faith. And I like the graphic way in which she described Jesus' birth, his coming into the world. But it also has implications for culture. Jesus was born of mother, woman, but the sacred text says he was born in Bethlehem of Judea during the reign of Herod the king. And it raises the question of the relationship between Christianity and culture. It raises a number of other issues, but fast forwarding to get to a negative perspective on, historically negative perspective on African people and things African, which has plagued our history for far too long, I think comes out of a theological understanding. And it's particularly the case of churches of a historic Calvinist background, whose theological premise is, as a result of the fall, the human person is totally depraved. There is no continuity. And I suppose from another theological perspective, it's when you look at the Father, the coming of the Son into the world, of the gift and outpouring of the Holy Spirit, We're inclined to think of God from this historical perspective. First the Father, and then he sent the Son after things went wrong. He came and rectified it, then he sent the Holy Spirit, not realizing that God is at one and the same time, and without exception. Creator, Redeemer, Savior, Sanctifier. He didn't become Savior X years after the fall. He is always Savior and Redeemer. It raises the theological, philosophical issue too of natural theology and natural revelation. One of the panelists, I think it's Carlton, if it's not Ian, made the point that, probably Nicolette, that Roman Catholicism as a church seems to be more comfortable with our African retentions than those who do not come out of a religious tradition, which does not subscribe to the Calvinist dictum that the fall made everybody totally depraved, that there is no continuity, that there is no such thing as natural theology, there's no such thing as natural revelation. And that flies in the face of Scripture itself, depending on how you read it.
Thank you, Canon.
But the good news is the people, despite these historical theological backgrounds, are at the subconscious level very much involved. And even in the churches, they may not call it by its name, but a rose by any other name is just as sweet. When we see these dances consistent with our African rhythm and everything else going on. And permit me just one more point, because you see, we can learn from the ancient Greeks in this regard. You go into travel around the Mediterranean, you see these statues all over the place. And I like the perspective which Plato has taken on it in his Theory of the Forms, where what is before us in the form of an incarnation, a Carlton, a human person, if you like. And the beauty of we don't run away from that. We embrace that and see that it's pointing to something which is positive and beyond itself. But some people are afraid of the emotions, and that has a whole host of implications.
Thank you, Canon. Let's talk a bit about death, shall we? Not sure who wants to take this. I'm inclined to ask Evie as a Jamaican, because we have this question from a person who's actually doing a PhD research. And it appears from his research that to be both continuity and discontinuity of African and Caribbean folk religion with death rituals such as 9 nights and superstitions. My question is, because participants are largely unaware or focused on the pre-Christian roots of these rituals, can they ever be redeemed to yield new pathways for inculturation of Christianity?
Okay, that's an interesting take on the whole thing. Because as a Jamaican, if there's a 9 night, clearly I am there. And this is part of the ritual. And it is, and I'm very clear, I'm very aware that the concept of the spirits, remember I said that one of the things about Canon Garden was that, you know, you have the exorcism, you get rid of the evil spirits, the spirits that are bad, but that you also welcome the spirits that are good. And I see a lot in the West African traditions that and the cosmology that recognizes that there are all sorts of spirits about. And I don't have any problem in believing that those who love me and who have gone over to the other side are concerned about our welfare. My dear friend George Walkup, who taught here at Queen's, George used to say, okay, so why am I going to pray to St. Peter who don't know me too well? When my grandmother, who is at the feet of God and knows me very well, why I can't pray to her? Not as a God, but as a spirit who cares and is concerned. And Canon Sawyer had a lot to say about the whole respect for the ancestors and the presence of spirits. So, of course, the death rituals, and we don't take anything without a certain hermeneutic of suspicion. You know, you have to look at all, whether in the more classic European version of the Christianity that we have seen, or, you know, the more African ones. You have to look at all of them and see what's going on and what is happening. But honor the ancestors, spread the rum, yes. Be happy. Your grandmother go and dream you and tell you how things, that all will be well and which job you must apply for.
And what number to buy.
That.
Dulcie, just let me make a comment here, if I may.
I'll tell you what, I've got a question here, if you don't mind, Canon. Is it possible to know who asked the question about death rituals and lionites? Yes, we can say who it is. Lloyd, thank you for that question. But here's another question. If all churches were open to other beliefs and talk about them to children and youth, then we would be more aware and not afraid. And that same person made a comment earlier that as a little girl, as a child, there would be JUNKANOO parades, and it was very scary. The mask alone was frightening. Why, maybe Nicolette, you can explain to us why that kind of dress code then, for want of a better way of putting it, for JUNKANOO, the masks and everything else.
Wow. Okay, so so you asked this question and I'm supposed to answer it in like 3 minutes. So the mask in JUNKANOO, it is really interesting looking at it from a Bahamian perspective in it. The masks in JUNKANOO were originally meant to be frightening. They were designed to be frightening. They were the connection with the other side. And to this day, people still talk about the spirit of JUNKANOO and being not possessed, but recognizing this otherness that is involved in the performance of JUNKANOO. But there's something that happened in the Bahamas, and it was recognized as happening in Trinidad as well. As the parade, we call it a parade now, as the festival moved from the margins of society, where it was being celebrated by those people who were oppressed and being used as a means of self-reclamation and also of protest. As that became part of the national representation, and again, this goes to self-negation, right? As it became part of the national representation, it got prettier and prettier. And as it became part of the national representation, you also have to understand that the Bahamian self-imagination involves performativity for the other, primarily the tourist, okay? JUNKANOO, paradoxically, is not really seen by that many tourists because it's very hard for a tourist to get to JUNKANOO. We don't market it to people. It's very hard to buy a ticket. It's very hard, even if you come of a ship, which is in port and you can hear the drums, just to get to JUNKANOO, get past the people, the Bahamians who are there, is difficult. But that doesn't mean that in our imagination, when we enact ourselves, there is an element of talking to ourselves, but there's also a very conscious element of packaging it for the other. And there was a period that took place over several decades of what we call modernization of JUNKANOO. And what the modernization of JUNKANOO was accomplishing was this removal of the frightening and turning it into the beautiful and the pretty and the self-expression, but I don't even know how to put it, palatable. I don't think this answers the question about the mask. I think Father Sam came closest to the question of the mask when he linked JUNKANOO with the first fruits festivals and so on of Africa, and Ian talked about the secret societies and the ancestral performances and so on and so forth. So the masking is really important. And one of the things that distinguishes JUNKANOO to this day from Carnival is JUNKANOO is a putting on. It's a covering up. It is a disguising, as opposed to Carnival, which is a stripping down of a bearing, of there's embodiment going on both sides, but it's an opposite kind of thing. I know I didn't answer your question. I went off in a direction, but still.
Can I respond to this?
Please do.
1 minute. No, it just sparks my thinking. You know, this thing about fearing the mask. You know, sitting down with Canon Sands when I was doing this work, he said something, I don't know if he remembered, but we conceal to reveal. There's this reversal that happens. The thing that you fear most actually is the thing that is most liberative. And this makes sense theologically, simply because, you know, if you were, for our good Pentecostal friends, if you were to really encounter God, you'd be scared out of your mind, as they were. Let me give you an example of this. The day of Pentecost, I mean, it's quite a scary scene. Mm-hmm. Everything blowing open. You know, people speaking in strange tongues. They think everybody was drunk and carrying on. It's the thing that is most powerful, that moves you most deeply, that you don't quite understand. And I think JUNKANOO does that kind of invoking. Mm-hmm. And the thing that is pretty, that is peaceful, that is presented, could actually be the dangerous thing. Ian Strachan has a book, Paradise and Plantation. And it's this idea that what we think is paradise is actually the revived plantation. It looks good, but it ain't good. But the thing that we deny and are afraid of is actually the thing that is often the most liberative.
Just let me make one comment.
Just add something.
No, go ahead, Ian. Go ahead, Ian.
This is going to be very brief.
Okay.
JUNKANOO, I remember being told by my late uncle, in his childhood, it was terribly frightening. They had a figure, it was just one man. They called him Solomon Hole. He would dress up. It's a part of the secret society tradition. It was meant to frighten the children and keep them in line. But to jump to tourism, I think I look at JUNKANOO and I say to myself, white tourists don't want any part of JUNKANOO, really. Think about it. There's a moment where all you can see is 200 Black men beating huge drums. I don't think white people really want a part of that. That's only so many of them really want a part of that. And it has such power over the people when it happens. That's not for everybody. That's for insiders. There's something about JUNKANOO that will never be for people who are not African. They can't get into all of it. The pretty part, yeah, okay. But there's a core moment. You have to be you have to be a Black person to hear that and feel that and be like, yeah, I home.
Well, on that point, before we go to Canon Kirkley, here's a question and a statement really. African continuities manifest in Pentecostalism in many implicit ways. For example, the significance of dreams and visions, affiliation with getting in the spirit, jumping up and down, and even connections with kinship relationships within the church. It just isn't acknowledged explicitly. So Catholicism has a framework which lends itself to explicit expressions of Africanism through its worship of saints. So maybe it's reincarnated. I don't know. Canon, you wanted to add to that, or do you want to just say what you were going to say earlier?
Well, yes, let me speak and then see how comprehensive I could be in a short period of time. I think in the short term, it's a matter of education. We, especially in the Bahamas, and speaking personally, have been nurtured with a European bias. Everything that was beautiful looked like Europeans. For Jesus to be Jesus, he has to look like one of them too. Never mind the word became flesh, all right? Good music is what you get from over there. We've been nurtured in that for centuries. While simultaneously, Africa, people and things African, and especially things African, especially from a religious cultural perspective, have been demonized. Mm-hmm. And we have been educated into that. That has become a part of our way of, at least some of us, looking at Africa as well. So education is the key. And I think too, at the national level, at the political level, they need the education no less than the children in the classroom. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't know your African story, if you don't know your African heritage, you can legislate till the cows come home and you're not dealing with the reality. So education is key. But getting back to the death, I think that this is tied up with the whole African concept of ontology. You have to understand the worldview. I made reference to it briefly in my presentation. Where there is this two-dimensional time frame, the Sasa or mini, macro, micro, and the Zamani, the macro, and the relationship between the two. Where time moved anti-clockwise, it didn't go clockwise. So you go from the Sasa micro time into Zamani time, and the cycle continues. And in Zamani, you find the ancestors. There's always this connection between the living and those who have gone, between Sasa and Zamani. And it is not ancestral worship. No, they're not worshiping their ancestors. And this was the perspective of the European, and they led us to that kind of misconception to further demonize these aspects of our African heritage. And they had such a profound respect for the dead. One could talk for another hour or two on this. You know, even during chattel slavery, how they prepared to make sure that they had a proper burial, the burial societies which emerged as a result, everything pertaining to the dead. But the thing is, traditional African ontology, sub-Saharan West African ontology, in the absence of which we'll miss a lot of what we would like to hold dear, including the cultural retentions which we are slipping away in JUNKANOO. The Mass was associated with the invocation of the ancestors into Sasa time to share in the joy and celebrations of those, and during crises, to invoke the presence of the ancestors, because they were associated with the social mores which led to stable civil society. And you would turn to them to help and bring things back to normal and civility. I mean, I repeat, education is the key, for which there is absolutely no substitute. And until we start educating our people, we'll have too many more generations with this Eurocentric bias and this demonizing, at least denial of our African heritage. And all it would do is cement the kind of schizophrenia, which I think Ian made reference to earlier on this evening. Yes. It's that our people are being torn apart, largely by religious schizophrenia and cultural schizophrenia. What we need now is to heal ourselves and our people.
Thank you.
And the way in which we can do this is by claiming our African heritage.
So was the question to finish on. We want to finish within the next 5 minutes if we can, but to give everyone a final say, let's hear your voice next, Evie. In regards to how Canon just helped us to say, look, it's about education. How do we then promote this? How do we move forward with it?
All right. Thank you, Dulcie, for really setting me up there. Yeah, how do we move forward? That is a question we need to work through. And I want to say boldly that we need to make sure that in our theological institutions, we not only continue we not only move forward, but we continue to reflect on these issues all the time, because this is of relevance to those of us of African descent, but also to people of European descent and so on. It's not only Jamaicans and Caribbean people have wake, you know, the Irish go full out, and what's going on there and what has been demonized as well. Within, and Carlton made reference to it, within our churches, what are we talking about in the youth groups, in the sermons, in the Bible studies, not just, you know, Holy Mary like she's a plaster saint, but, you know, the real, what does this embodiment that we celebrate, what does it actually mean? And again, holy be our bodies. How do we really help our young people to appreciate that they are not something of their bodies don't come from the devil, and certain parts of their bodies definitely don't come from the devil. God make it too. Right? So I say.
Thank you. Let's come to you, Ian.
Dulcie, you're blushing.
No,
I was caught up in what
Edie was saying.
Yes. No, I just want to say that this is such a fruitful, such a rich conversation. I'm happy to have been a part of it. And I think JUNKANOO is such a remarkable phenomenon and so compelling. And I think my country is one that is just scared of its history. There's some fundamental truths which create great discomfort in people. Slavery is something that creates discomfort. You know, race relations, the tourism culture, the affluent white minority and their integration into society. Conversations about race, conversations about slavery and our history are difficult for people. I remember explaining to a group of students that, you know, so John Hawkins brought slaves on a ship called the Jesus, and that, you know, slavery took away our religion. And they were like, "What you trying to make us angry? Trying to make us mad?" You know, I said, "But this is our history, right?" So I think Canon is right. There's a lot of work to do for us to reckon with these things, and I commend you, Carlton, for your work, and it's really been an honor and a pleasure to be here with you all this evening.
Thank you, Ian, for coming. Let's come to you, Nicolette, before we go to Canon, and then give Carlton the final word, as it were. Where do you go from here?
Yeah, I don't honestly know. Well, I don't know. I would prefer to defer to Carlton, because I did not read the whole book. I skipped over those bits that didn't like fit within the box that I was given to talk about, but I saw where he talked about healing and the way in which this can be a channel for healing. And I just want to open that door and let Carlton take over from here, because yeah.
Okay, but with your own work with JUNKANOO, you know, you've done your own cultural anthropological work. But anyway, thank you. And then Canon, you might have already said what you want to say finally. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just one more word. And this is by way of encouragement to all of the panelists, but especially Carlton. It may sound like an advertisement, but it's just information to make a point. We have recently introduced a important master's degree in Caribbean and African theology. It's an interdisciplinary degree involving not only theology, but also philosophy, including diaspora, African philosophy, Caribbean philosophy, and of course, African philosophy. It's all an attempt during my time to help the leadership of the church, those whom I have the privilege in studying with and working with here at Codrington College, to see the missing dimension of Christian theology. and realize that there's more to theology than what we get from Western Europe in general, all right?
Mm-hmm.
And it is my intention, Carlton, to include your book in the bibliography for this master's program. And Evie, I'm already aware of, this is a wholesome complement to the existent corpus of Caribbean theology. And I'm so excited about it. So keep up the good works. And if I can be of any assistance at any time, if only to help encourage you on, I'm always available.
Thank you, Canon. Thank you very much. And here at the Center for Black Theology, it's all about prioritizing the experience of African people, African heritage people. And so tonight's conversation chimes with that. And it's a Caribbean conversation, but indeed it's about our history and our ancestry. Carlton, let's let you have the final word in relation to your book. How encouraged have you been this evening for us to put this on for you?
Yeah, I'm grateful. I feel very blessed. Do buy the book. Make no mistake about it. Buy, recommend, buy, promote. But to those who have made the time, thank you so much. You know, I mean, truly, without your scholarly contribution, not just to Caribbean theology, but to my country, my nation, my people, I would not have been able to do this work as well as I could have. You know, you are very much the link, and I'm grateful. And for Evie, you're not Bahamian, but you can see that supervisions were quite interesting. No, man, Evie, I had the supervisor I needed, and I was very blessed to have Evie. So thank you so much for what you've sown into my life, and for this space. You know, I am just a voice, researching something that means something to me. There are so many people who need to do this kind of research. And I would encourage more Caribbean people of Caribbean roots, to not sit down but ask the bigger questions. And just to my beloved Bahamaland, you know, I born, bred, and dead behavior. But we have a lot of work to do, and we have a lot of those conversations. We need to have those conversations, because if we do not, then the cycle continues and continues. Ian said something about a microcosm, a microstate. You know, there's always the threat of some other imperial entity causing us to reconceptualize who we are. Identity is very fluid, and we need to look at it seriously. And if these two parts of our identity are before us, and we can do something and have those conversations, let's do that. Not just an academic conversation or a church conversation, all of us having that conversation. So
one last question to you then, Carlton, in terms of your new home in Britain. You're one of us now, Black British.
No.
Is there any relevant? Well, of course it's relevant, but what can you say to us as Black British who are somewhat removed to an extent from the Caribbean?
Yeah, find out who you are. Even if who you are might be a bit hazy, even if it might be a little chaotic, even if it's somewhere in the background and you can't grab onto it, go and find it. Come to the Bahamas. come during Christmas time and New Year's Day. You would love it. Go back to Jamaica. Find your roots, because if you do not, you will not understand why your Pentecostalism is the way it is. And you will not hold on to the kind of power that has always been there, Windrush and until now and beyond, the legacies that are there. The thing I would like to say, I'd like to preach this anywhere and everywhere. You know, something happened called enslavement. Something happened called colonialism. We survived. that happened too.
Mhm.
And churches are beneath the surface. There's a dynamic where we have the power to heal and the power to survive. Find that. Yeah, find that.
Thank you, Carlton. Again, Evie, thank you. Nicolette, thank you.
Welcome.
Ian and Kirkley. And it's been a really stimulating evening. I'm sure you will agree. Thank you, everyone who's still on this call. Want to say thanks to Dawn Martin behind the scenes, pressing buttons. To Storm, doing a sterling job there in the chat. And again, it's been really a joy having all of you here on this call. This is the Black Theology Forum, hosted by the Centre for Black Theology. The next time we convene is in January. And I'm really, really pleased to say that our guest for the Black Theology Forum in January is none other than Professor Alan Aubrey Buzak. He will be our guest, and feel free to be part of that. Keep in touch with the Centre for Black Theology and let us have your email address if you want to be on the mailing list. We will let you know, okay? So we won't see you again until New Year in terms of this forum, but it's been a joy to support you, Carlton, in this way. Congratulations, very well done. And we know that God's going to bless you to do even more writing for us beyond this debut book.
And I think the panelists should write a book too. You should write.
Here we are. Okay, thank you, everyone. Good night.
Blessings.
God bless.